On paper, no steam locomotive in American history ever outmuscled Union Pacific's Big Boy. That is the story everyone tells. But buried in a single test log from a plant in Altoona, Pennsylvania, sits a number that quietly rewrites the record book. One locomotive, built by a railroad that had nothing to do with Union Pacific, generated more horsepower than the Big Boy ever produced in its life. It never became a legend. It never got a nickname, children shouted at trackside. Within 6 years of its debut, it was gone, cut apart for scrap while its rival's fame only grew. If this machine truly outpowered the mightiest steam engine in America, why does almost nobody remember its name? The answer is a story about the difference between what a locomotive can do once under perfect conditions and what it can do every single day for 30 years. Union Pacific's Big Boy needs no introduction to anyone who has ever stood trackside in Wyoming. 25 of them were built between 1941 and 1944, each stretching over 132 feet and weighing more than 600 tons fully loaded with coal and water. Their 488 wheel arrangement became shorthand for raw, dependable power, 6,290 horsepower at the drawbar in official tests, and 135,375 pounds of tractive effort, enough to drag 3,600-ton freight trains over Sherman Hill without a single helper engine. 8 of the originals survive today. Number 4, 1014, has been fully restored and draws crowds in every town it passes through. For most Americans, the Big Boy isn't just a locomotive. It's the definition of what a steam engine is supposed to look and sound like. Its legend has been reinforced for 80 years by museums, documentaries, model trains, and a restoration program that turned it into a rolling monument. But 3 states east, on a different railroad entirely, a different set of engineers was chasing a different obsession. Not size, not fame, but raw thermal output. The Pennsylvania Railroad in the 1940s ran the busiest main line in the country, hauling more freight tonnage per mile than almost any railroad in the world, and its engineers had grown convinced that the era of the simple articulated giant was already outdated. What if a locomotive didn't need to be enormous to be powerful? What if the answer was efficiency, not bulk? That question led to the Q2, a duplex-drive freight locomotive built by the Pennsylvania Railroad's own Altoona shops in partnership with Baldwin Locomotive Works. Unlike the Big Boy's articulated frame, which hinged in the middle to snake through curves, the Q2 used a rigid frame with 2 separate sets of driving wheels, a 4-4-6-4 wheel arrangement, unlike anything else running in America. The idea was to split the workload across 2 independent engines under one boiler, each with its own cylinders, reducing the pounding stress that came from a single set of enormous pistons. Where the Big Boy relied on brute mechanical simplicity, the Q2 was an attempt to engineer around the physical limits of steam itself. The numbers behind the Q2 read like a wish list for post-war American industry. Its boiler, one of the largest ever built for a duplex locomotive, operated at 300 pounds per square inch, feeding 4 cylinders split between the front and rear engine units. Pennsylvania Railroad engineers, obsessed with data in a way that bordered on institutional paranoia, sent the Q2 to the railroad's own test plant in Altoona, a facility built specifically to strap a locomotive to a stationary set of rollers and measure exactly how much power it could generate without a single wheel touching open track. What the dynamometer recorded there in 1945 stunned even the engineers who built the machine. The Q2 produced 7,987 indicated horsepower, the highest output ever measured for a reciprocating steam locomotive in the United States, more than 1,600 horsepower above the Big Boy's best drawbar figure. Even accounting for the difference between indicated horsepower measured inside the cylinders and drawbar. Horsepower measured at the coupler, the Pennsylvania Railroad's own engineering reports placed the Q2's sustained drawbar output above 7,000 horsepower at speed, a figure Union Pacific's giant never approached in any documented test. For a brief moment, on a test stand in central Pennsylvania, a locomotive smaller and lighter than the Big Boy had outproduced it by a wide margin. Out on the main line, the Q2 backed up the paper numbers, at least at first. Assigned to the flat, fast stretches between Crestline, Ohio and Fort Wayne, Indiana, the locomotives could reportedly move 125-car freight trains at a sustained 70 miles per hour, a speed that would have been unthinkable for the big boys' mountain-grade assignments. Engineers who ran the Q2 in its first year described a machine that, at speed, felt almost weightless, the divided drive smoothing out the violent hammering that plagued conventional steam engines at high RPM. For a railroad built on speed and volume rather than mountain grades, it looked briefly like the future had arrived on Pennsylvania rails. Then came the part the press releases never mentioned: wheel slip. The Q2's rear engine unit, carrying less weight than the front, struggled for traction at low speed. Crews reported the locomotive breaking loose and slipping violently when starting a heavy train from a dead stop, sometimes for several seconds at a time, hammering the rail and chewing through tires and crank pins with every incident. Where the big boy's simple, low-speed design was built specifically to dig in and pull without slipping, the Q2 had been optimized for speed at the expense of the exact quality that made a freight locomotive useful in daily service: the ability to start a heavy train reliably every single time without tearing itself apart in the process. Maintenance records from the Pennsylvania Railroad's Crestline and Fort Wayne shops tell the rest of the story. Mechanics logged repeated cases of damaged crank pins, worn valve gear, and rail surfaces gouged by slipping drivers. Because the Q2's divided drive system was unique to only 26 locomotives ever built, spare parts had to be custom machined rather than pulled from a common inventory, and shop crews trained on conventional steam found themselves learning an entirely new mechanical language. Where the big boy's simplicity meant it could be serviced by any competent steam shop on the Union Pacific system, the Q2 required specialized attention that only a handful of Pennsylvania railroad shops could provide. By 1949, the calculus had already shifted. Diesel-electric locomotives, quietly proving themselves on the Pennsylvania Railroad's own roster, offered something the Q2 never could: consistency. A diesel unit didn't slip on a cold start, didn't require a dedicated crew of specialists, and didn't need to be pulled from service every few thousand miles for repairs that no other shop in the system could perform. Internal Pennsylvania Railroad correspondence from the period increasingly framed steam, and the Q2 specifically, as a maintenance liability rather than a technical triumph. The last Q2 was retired from mainline service by 1950, just 6 years after the class debuted, and all 26 were scrapped shortly after, their unique parts too specialized to be reused and too obscure to be preserved. Not a single Q2 survives today. No museum piece, no static display, no restored example thundering across a heritage line for crowds to photograph. The class that once held the horsepower record for American steam left behind nothing but test logs, a handful of builders' photographs, and a line in Pennsylvania Railroad technical journals that most rail historians have to go looking for. Compare that to the big boy, with 8 survivors and an active restoration and touring program that puts it in front of hundreds of thousands of people every year, and the imbalance becomes obvious. One locomotive generated more raw power on a test stand. The other became the yardstick every steam locomotive is still measured against 80 years later. Out on the main line, the Q2 backed up the paper numbers, at least at first. Assigned to the flat, fast stretches between Crestline, Ohio and Fort Wayne, Indiana, the locomotives could reportedly move 125-car freight trains at a sustained 70 miles per hour, a speed that would have been unthinkable for the big boys' mountain-grade assignments. Engineers who ran the Q2 in its first year described a machine that, at speed, felt almost weightless, the divided drive smoothing out the violent hammering that plagued conventional steam engines at high RPM. For a railroad built on speed and volume rather than mountain grades, it looked briefly like the future had arrived on Pennsylvania rails. Then came the part the press releases never mentioned: wheel slip. The Q2's rear engine unit, carrying less weight than the front, struggled for traction at low speed. Crews reported the locomotive breaking loose and slipping violently when starting a heavy train from a dead stop, sometimes for several seconds at a time, hammering the rail and chewing through tires and crank pins with every incident. Where the big boy's simple low-speed design was built specifically to dig in and pull without slipping, the Q2 had been optimized for speed at the expense of the exact quality that made a freight locomotive useful in daily service: the ability to start a heavy train reliably every single time without tearing itself apart in the process. Maintenance records from the Pennsylvania Railroad's Crestline and Fort Wayne shops tell the rest of the story. Mechanics logged repeated cases of damaged crank pins, worn valve gear, and rail surfaces gouged by slipping drivers. Because the Q2's divided drive system was unique to only 26 locomotives ever built, spare parts had to be custom machined rather than pulled from a common inventory, and shop crews trained on conventional steam found themselves learning an entirely new mechanical language. Where the big boy simplicity meant it could be serviced by any competent steam shop on the Union Pacific system, the Q2 required specialized attention that only a handful of Pennsylvania railroad shops could provide. By 1949, the calculus had already shifted. Diesel-electric locomotives, quietly proving themselves on the Pennsylvania Railroad's own roster, offered something the Q2 never could: consistency. A diesel unit didn't slip on a cold start, didn't require a dedicated crew of specialists, and didn't need to be pulled from service every few thousand miles for repairs that no other shop in the system could perform. Internal Pennsylvania Railroad correspondence from the period increasingly framed steam, and the Q2 specifically, as a maintenance liability rather than a technical triumph. The last Q2 was retired from mainline service by 1950, just 6 years after the class debuted, and all 26 were scrapped shortly after, their unique parts too specialized to be reused and too obscure to be preserved. Not a single Q2 survives today. No museum piece, no static display, no restored example thundering across a heritage line for crowds to photograph. The class that once held the horsepower record for American steam left behind nothing but test logs, a handful of builders' photographs, and a line in Pennsylvania Railroad technical journals that most rail historians have to go looking for. Compare that to the big boy with 8 survivors and an active restoration and touring program that puts it in front of hundreds of thousands of people every year, and the imbalance becomes obvious. One locomotive generated more raw power on a test stand. The other became the yardstick every steam locomotive is still measured against 80 years later.